So I just wanted to come on here and talk about my feelings overall right now in regards to the UFC. Now, if you've been in my live streams for quite a bit now, you would kind of understand that I am not really having the most fun watching these UFC fight nights. And overall, I feel like this product that the UFC is giving us has been less than stellar. Now, when it comes to the pay-per-views, I think they're amazing. I think overall the UFC's done a very good job this year of giving us overall really good pay-per-views. However, I think since they're giving us such good pay-per-views that now we're kind of lacking in the fight nights. What the fight nights are to me and how I see them is basically the driver of what keeps the UFC relevant as time goes on in between the pay-per-views because right because the pay-per-views are the big money maker. They're the big moolah cha-ching dealer for the UFC. The pay-per-views are what keeps people kind of still tuning in at least once a month to the UFC, while the fight nights are here for people to basically enjoy on the weekends. And it felt like in the past to me, and I don't know if anybody else feels this way, but I felt like the fight nights maybe a few years ago were just so much better. And nowadays, man, I just can't say the same thing. And I think the UFC needs to find a way to maybe reform their fight night strategy or try to figure out what they can do to make fight nights better because one thing I feel like they're lacking right now, and what makes it so hard as a UFC content creator, is that I feel like these fight nights make it really hard for me to make content. Now, this is not my daily job. I don't do this full time. This is a side hustle for me. I do this for fun. This is my hobby. I enjoy it. So when I want to make content and I sit down and I look at my notes of video ideas and I'm like, wow, this shit is dry as fuck. What am I going to do with all this stuff in my notes? Because nothing seems too interesting to me nowadays. And when it comes to the UFC, I think it's probably on them. I do think it's their fault that I struggle to create good fundamental ideas. And sometimes I feel like I'm digging, right? If I was doing this full time, God bless myself, I wouldn't be able to do it because it would be me just grabbing at straws. I'd be looking for things to make content about. I would be trying to maybe blow things up that aren't really that big of a deal. And luckily, like this is, again, a hobby for me. So I'm not trying to do that. But if this was my main source of money, I would be struggling right now because the UFC just doesn't put anything out that's content worthy. And I know this is a year-round sport, right? This sport goes on for pretty much what, like 50, 45 weeks a year. There's like maybe 1 week every few months. And then, of course, the holidays during Christmas time where the UFC takes a break. But for the most part, the UFC is turning around fight nights every single week. And if there isn't a week that it's on, it's very rare. So I am willing to give them some grace when it comes to having some pretty bad fight nights. But again, dude, it just feels like none of these fight nights are really big names. And back in the past, it felt like we were having top 5 guys in fight nights. That if you were in a main event of a fight night, you were fighting for the belt if you won that main event. And nowadays, I don't really see that. And with next week being Neil Magny versus Carlos Prates, now obviously great matchup, but not because of Neil Magny. It's really because of Carlos Prates that we are probably tuning into that fight night because he is a really good prospect in himself. But I just want to go back and I want to look at some past fight nights back in like 2021, 2022, and just kind of verify my information, see if I'm correct, because I have this feeling that the past fight nights were just 20 times better, and I want to see if I'm correct. And now that I'm looking at these fight nights already into the 2020 season, which was a pretty rough year for most sports in the entirety of the world, especially in the US, because we know of the whole issue that happened that year. But I'm looking into it right now, and I already see just overall maybe a better year in terms of fight nights, right? And I'm looking at the first fight night. It's Blades versus Dos Santos, Curtis Blades versus Junior Dos Santos. All right, still a good main event. I think it's main event worthy. We also have Paul Felder versus Dan Hooker, Benavidez versus Figueiredo, which I think was for a title fight maybe. was actually for a title fight back then. Yeah, it was for a title fight on a fight night, which is amazing for flyweight, honestly. Kevin Lee versus Oliveira was on a fight night. I think after March 21st, a lot got canceled because of what was going on during that time. So Woodley Edwards, Ngannou versus Rosenstrike, Ferguson versus Gaethje was a pay-per-view. Smith versus Teixeira fight night, Overeem versus Harris, Woodley versus Burns. Like, I'm seeing big names and guys who were making their way towards that title shot during that time in 2020, during a pretty rough time. We even had Whitaker versus Till in 2020. Some pullouts in 2021 happened, and that was a good stacked year of fight nights. And nowadays, man, it feels like every now and then we just don't really get to see what we really want from the UFC, if you know what I mean. I mean, just going through our most recent fight nights, we had Moreno versus Albazi. We had Mikel Pereira versus Alexander Hernandez, Royval versus Tyra. Moicano Santini was a good one, but that's like one every now and then. Burns versus Brady. Burns is kind of falling off, and Brady isn't really a big name. Tabur versus Spivak. What are we doing? Sandhagen versus Nurmagomedov is a good one. You know, like, it feels like few and far between we're finding good fight nights in the UFC. I mean, Tabur versus Spivak is just, I mean, abominable. And then at one point we had Jandaroba versus Amanda Lemos as a main event of a fight night. We also had Macy Barber versus Rose Namajunas as a fight night. I mean, Wicker versus Chimaev got canceled, which would have been a good one. Kanir Mavov is pretty good. Barboza versus Murphy is pretty good. Like, some of these just aren't the best. We had Mateus Nicolau versus Alex Perez for a fight night main event this year, and Nicolau is now cut from the UFC. There's just been a lot of really not that interesting fight nights this year, and it's pretty tough. And I think to go along with this, because obviously the fight nights are just one thing, and I can go about the fight nights all damn day. I could just rant to you about how the fight nights are shitty. It's hard to watch. There's boring fights, not any big names, no top ranked top 5 guys who are also carrying the UFC to fight on fight nights. Like Max Holloway, no longer on fight nights because obviously he's fighting for a belt now, but they're putting him on pay-per-views now because of the BMF belt. Like, the BMF belt is kind of making, you know, fight nights worse, honestly. Let's be real here, because what they are now doing is, instead of putting guys who probably should fight on a fight night in a crowded arena, they're now putting them on a pay-per-view for a BMF belt, which does hurt the stock of that next week. Like, I would not mind whatsoever if they just put Holloway versus Gaethje for the BMF belt on a fight night, a crowded fight night. That would have been absolutely amazing, but instead they put it on a pay-per-view. And speaking about the pay-per-views, I think the UFC has to stack these, because there's nobody really left in the UFC who can put on a good pay-per-view, right? Adesanya lost his belt. He was a big pay-per-view name who sold pay-per-view buys. Conor McGregor hasn't fought in a very, very long time. John Jones is going to retire here soon. We won't have him for much longer. At flyweight, no one can really sell a pay-per-view there. At bantamweight, O'Malley, who was probably the biggest star at bantamweight in a very long time, who could raise that division up to be a big top-level money-making division, lost his belt to Merab, who won't sell much, let's be honest here. At welterweight, Bilal Muhammad, not going to sell that much. Also, he is getting up there in age. I don't think he'll have the belt for too long, because he just is Bilal Muhammad. The UFC would do whatever they want to get that belt off of him. So with Bilal, it is what it is. At middleweight, we have Dricus, which is, he has good narratives, man, and he has a good story, but I think he needs more time to really develop into a big name star. And obviously, what I'm trying to say here is that there's really only 2 fighters right now who could possibly carry the UFC into, actually 3 maybe, who could carry the UFC into a stardom level, who could actually sell a good number of pay-per-views. And that's Topuria, that is Tom Aspinall, and that is Alex Pereira, right? Alex Pereira is, I mean, saving UFC cards by the day. If a top fight pulls out, guess who's filling in? That's Alex Pereira. Now, Topuria is not fighting as often as Alex Pereira, but I think his resume right now, beating Volk, beating Holloway, is one of the best in the UFC right now, especially in your first 2 title defenses. He's slowly developing himself into a star. He could sell pay-per-views, a lot of them, in the future. Now, Tom Aspinall, is he going to fight John Jones, right? Because that fight would be absolutely massive. It would sell a ton of pay-per-views. That's where I'm kind of basing this whole Tom Aspinall thing off. And if he does beat John Jones, then guess what? He's a star. He's certified. First guy to ever actually give John Jones his real certified first L. So we need that for Tom Aspinall. So he has the potential to be that if he does fight John Jones and beat him. But again, not there yet. So really, it just is Alex Pereira and Ilya Taporia, and that's literally it. And if those two guys are on a pay-per-view, is it selling? Is it selling? And I don't think it really is. I think it might get a good push, right? So what the UFC has to do is they have to put on a an amazing amount of fights on there that make it really hard to just not buy the pay-per-view, right? If they're not going to have this big star-studded name like an Alex Pereira, which you can even argue that his name value still wouldn't sell a ton of pay-per-views, but if an Alex Pereira isn't on there, if an O'Malley isn't on there, if a Topuria isn't on there, who the fuck is going to sell the pay-per-view, right? So they have to put on a bunch of different matchups that make you go, oh shit, I can't wait to watch, I don't know, Holloway versus Gaethje in the co-main event, right? They pretty much have to pull all of their big names and put them on pay-per-views, which leaves no room for fight nights. So I guess the big whole shebang that I'm trying to get here is that the UFC is at a position where I don't think they're growing. I don't think they're getting better. I think we're at one of the most stagnant points in the UFC where things are just kind of dull from a week to week basis until you hit the pay-per-view. I'm pretty much, for the most part, just waiting for that pay-per-view to hit to where I can actually feel super excited to watch the UFC, right? I'm not too excited to watch Magny versus Prates. I'm excited to watch Prates fight, but until I get to that part of the fight night, do I really care? I mean, Cody Garbrandt is in the co-main event, so I will be interested to see what he's doing. Gerald Mearshart, GM3. Yeah, I like GM3 for the most part. Ricky Tercios, don't care. Luana Pinheiro versus Jillian Robertson, don't care. Dusko Todorovic is still in the UFC, which is kind of surprising. So, but again, don't care. Like, this card just has like no real prospects on it. I mean, we do have Simmelsberger and Charles Radke, but they've already lost in the UFC. Yeah, there's no really super huge names on this card who would make me excited besides Carlos Prates and Cody Garbrandt. That's it. Like, if you only tuned in for the main event and the co-main event for this fight night, I wouldn't blame you. But knowing me, I want to find that new next prospect, so I will be watching pretty much the majority or all of the fights on this card. I might zone out for, a few of them. I might zone out for Melissa Dixon versus Claudio Segula, or what else is on the card? The Pinheiro versus Robertson fight. I might zone out for that one because I don't really care that much. But I mean, what I'm trying to say here is that these fight nights suck. The UFC has to put all their stock into the pay-per-view cards for them to sell, and it leaves out a lot of room from a week-to-week basis. And that doesn't create any narratives. Their promotion work, I think, is really abysmal by the UFC. I don't feel like they're promoting fighters enough, right? I don't feel like fighters themselves are promoting themselves enough. I don't think the UFC is doing them any favors. Like, I truly believe the majority of fighters just don't know how to really sell themselves to be a big name, right? Like, even Max Holloway, he's a huge name because of his skill in the octagon, not because of his personality. If you watched any of the press conferences for the Topuria fight between him and Holloway, Holloway was just a pretty still bag of, can't wait till Saturday night, man. Can't wait till October 26th, man. I'm gonna win October 26th. We'll see how I'm 2026. I don't know what he was saying, bro, but it was just one of the most. It showed that he didn't have much, skill level on the mic, which is pretty tough. But overall, man, these fighters just don't know really what they're doing. I know, like, some of these guys should be able to just be huge names because of they're backed by the UFC. Just being a fighter in the UFC, just having the UFC tag on yourself should be enough to where you can promote yourself in a very significant way. But some of these guys just don't do it. And I praise Aljo for this a lot, Aljamain Sterling, because he isn't like the most, awesome guy to listen to. Like, you're not really stoked to watch a Sterling video. But what I do give him credit for is that he's actually trying. Like, he's trying to have a YouTube channel. He's trying to grow himself and grow his name value. It's just that he doesn't get KOs, and he has that whole thing with Piotr Jan with the knee and him basically giving up and all that stuff. So his name is already tainted, so it might be a bad sort of deal. But I think most UFC fighters, if they actually went out there and tried to do what Aljo's doing, they would probably be successful, right? If Peyton Talbot, which I do think he did a YouTube video with Full Violence recently, so I mean, but if Peyton Talbot, man, was just going crazy with big name interviews, man, then I think he would be a way bigger star than what he is. He already is a huge star right now. Well, not a huge star, but he is becoming a star in the UFC. But I think if he did a little bit more, he would be an even bigger star. But he's trying, so I do respect him for that. He is my twin brother, by the way. If you didn't notice, me and Peyton Talbot are biological twins. Just separated by a couple of years because he's older than me, but it is what it is. But just in general, man, I don't feel like the UFC is getting enough guys who are big names to fight often. And you know what? I'll go ahead and say it, man. This might be a pretty sensitive topic for some people, but fighter pay, I don't believe is real, man. I don't believe the fighter pay issue is real, because if these fighters were broke, if they're really that down bad, why are we only seeing them fight once a year? Like, let's be real here. Do you think Pereira's complaining about fighter pay? Do you think Kevin Hahn is complaining about fighter pay? Do you think anybody who is active right now, who is fighting every 4 months or so, is complaining about fighter pay? Probably not. Now, do some guys who are at the entry level of the UFC deserve to get paid more? Obviously, right? I think if you're making a UFC debut, 10 for 10 might be a bit egregious. I won't even lie to you. However, once you get up there, if you're not fighting every so often, if you're not injured or coming off a KO loss, a brutal KO loss, or even taking a bunch of damage in a fight, then there really isn't an excuse for you not to be fighting more often, or to at least be staying active. And these fighters, man, like, you get paid when you work, you get paid to fight. And of course, you're going to be a bit broke when you're not working. When you're not fighting, you're not getting paid. So I understand the whole, I got to pay my team. So fight more often. You know what I mean? If you have expenses, if you have the gym tax, then make more money, which it's pretty easy to do, because the UFC loves it when fighters go out there, go out of the way to make it a short notice bout. If you ever see a fighter filling on short notice, the UFC will always be kind to you. Even if you lose, the UFC will still appreciate you filling in on short notice. They will always, always, always bless a fighter who fills in for them whenever they need to. Sometimes they haven't, right? I don't know which. There probably is an example out there. I don't know one that I can think of right now, but I'm pretty positive every single time that a fighter is filled in on short notice, the UFC has been pretty nice to them afterwards, giving them either a nice matchup, a payday, or not cutting them from the UFC, So if I'm being honest, there really isn't much of a negative incentive besides maybe losing for you not to be a short notice fighter, right? If you're a guy and you're in the UFC and you already have lost in the UFC, there really isn't a reason why you shouldn't be, doing short notice fights. If you can't make weight, then stay in shape all year. I don't know what to tell you. Now, I know it's easy for me, who is behind a computer screen, to say, just fight more often, man. Just fight more often. But again, I don't see guys who are active in the UFC ever complain about fighter pay. I just don't. I haven't heard a single thing about Pereira saying that I don't get paid enough. It's always the fighters who rarely ever fight, who fight once a year, who fight once every year and a half, who complain about fighter pay, because they don't work. They don't do their job, which I understand, man. Like, sometimes shit happens and things happen. And I'm not going to sit here and just dunk on the fighters and be like, just get a good kid and fight more. So obviously there's more nuance to it than just that. But again, isn't it that hard to fight, once every 6 months at least? Twice a year would be very nice, so it is what it is. But to wrap this video up in a bowl, and but to wrap this video up in a bow, I think the UFC right now is in its worst state that it's ever been in a very, very long time. Now, there's been some pretty, bad times for the UFC, but I think as of post McGregor era, I would say, I think the McGregor era pretty much ended when he fought, or when he lost to Poirier the second time, when he broke his leg. I think since that fight, the UFC has been on a really, really downward spiral, a massive, massive downward spiral. And we need somebody to recover it, man. Some UFC fighter needs to recover it, and it can't be Pajeda. I'm sorry. Doesn't speak any English. He won't sell a million pay-per-views ever. Um, will the UFC ever get to a million pay-per-views ever again? Not for the next 20 years, man. I don't think we'll ever see a million in pay-per-view buys for a very, very long time. Maybe even, after I'm long gone and, in the grave. So we'll see what happens, man. But the UFC fight nights are just not very good. Obviously, the pay-per-views are stacked because they have to stack them because there's no big names that right now who could sell pay-per-view on their own. And yeah, that's it, man. Let me know your opinion down below in the comment section, how you feel about the current state of the UFC. That's my take. I think it's pretty bad, but that's it. Like, subscribe, bell icon notifications. See y'all later.